So we said, did you say about 20? Just make sure.
45 minutes.
Wow, 45 minutes? Okay.
Don't talk for all.
No, I won't. I'll run out of things to say surely before that. Okay, so as Derek said, my name is Joe Ripberger, and I am the Deputy Director of Research at the Center for Risk and Crisis Management here at the University of Oklahoma, and a research scientist at SIMS over at the National Weather Center. I have a PhD in political science and public policy, and I got that PhD about 2 years ago studying the way in which people think about and respond to man-caused crises and disasters. And after I finished my dissertation, sort of slowly made the transition to the dark side to understand a little bit more about how people think about and respond to environmentally caused crises and disasters. Most of my research thus far, at least in the last 2 years, has focused on sort of short-term weather events and how people think about and respond to those events. But I have, to some extent, dabbled into sort of longer-term weather climate world, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that research today. This is brand new research that's based in part on a huge Oklahoma-wide EPSCoR project that some people in the room are a part of, and I'm glad they're a part of, because if you guys have questions, they probably have answers. I'm excited to talk to you today, and what I'm going to talk about is this question here on the slide, which you guys probably already know the answer to, which is, do political beliefs distort public perceptions about weather and climate change? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? Well, I'm not going to surprise you guys today. So just to show you a little bit about the nature of the problem, this is some data that come from a national survey that we at CRCM run. I have run every year for the last 5-7 years. This question just asks people, in your view, are greenhouse gases, such as those resulting from the combustion of coal, oil, natural gas, and other materials, causing average global temperatures to rise? We have pretty good sort of percentages, what we might expect here. Close to 80%, a little bit less, maybe 75, 76% of the United States population says yes, they are. I don't know if you guys can notice this, but there's a little dip right there between 2009 and 2010. Does anybody know why that dip occurred? Anybody remember what happened in 2009? What's that? Economic crisis, but one other thing. What's that? It was a cold winter and ClimateGate. Does anybody remember that whole thing? Well, these survey data were collected almost a month after ClimateGate. It sort of fundamentally distorted the way that people thought about climate change in the United States, and we've been recovering ever since. Okay, so here's the ugly graph, right? It's nice. The one on the left side is kind of pretty. We're happy about that. But the ugly graph is this graph that shows you what happens when you take into account political ideology, right? You can see here from the blue line, close to, at point, almost 100% of self-described liberals believe that climate change is happening, believe that global temperatures are rising. It's now closer to 97%, but it's still pretty high. Conservatives, on the other hand, not quite the case, right? You see that this line hovers at or well below 50% and continues at or well below 50% of self-described conservatives saying that they believe that these gases, that these materials are causing global temperatures to rise. So the sample size here, we're talking about 6,000 people per year, randomly selected from the United States population, and it's demographically representative of the population. So we're pretty confident in these numbers. It's pretty similar to the numbers that you see from Gallup and other organizations. They ask slightly different questions, but the numbers are largely similar. Here's what we see when we instead of looking at beliefs, we look at risk perceptions. On a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 means no risk and 10 means extreme risk, how much risk do you think global warming poses to the people in the environment? National average is about 7. 7 out of 10, which is pretty high, right? Then when you take into account political ideology, you see the same exact pattern, right? You see self-described liberals, maybe you might call them Democrats, saying that that risk is close to an 8, in some cases all the way up to a 9, right? Fundamentally risky to society, climate change is. Whereas conservatives, again, are at or below that midpoint almost throughout the entire course. As you can see, the ClimateGate scandal that I talked about really affected conservative beliefs more so than Democrat beliefs about climate change. It more or less gave them a reason to doubt the science or to doubt the certainty associated with climate change. All right, so what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is not the fact that these things are politically polarized, but what causes ideological polarization in the United States. And there are a lot of things that cause ideological polarization. You guys have probably heard of some of them. But specifically, I want to know why, despite the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence, do partisans continue to disagree about climate change? And I'm going to argue, consistent with most of my colleagues, I think, that the primary driver of this is something called motivated cognition. Some people call it motivated reasoning. I call it motivated cognition because it's a slightly broader term that encompasses all sorts of psychological mechanisms that influence the way in which people sort of respond and see the world around them. Broadly speaking, motivated cognition refers to the way in which people subconsciously look for and accept information that is consistent with their beliefs, right, and avoid or reject information that is inconsistent with their beliefs, right? So if you're a Democrat or if you're a self-described liberal out there and you see information that is consistent with your beliefs, as you see a report that comes out, right, that says climate change is happening, you're going to take that report as fact, and it is going to affect your opinion about climate change. Yes. Yes. So yes.
Although they may be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are slight differences. I prefer to talk about conservatives and liberals because they have fundamentally different views about the roles, things like regulation, society, which tend to be more, tend to produce more pronounced differences on thoughts related to climate change. But in the United States, unlike other countries, it's almost the correlation between sort of liberals and Democrats and Republicans and conservatives is very close to one, right? So
but anyway, there is in some way they say that the division by party is going to be reflecting the rotation.
Yes.
But the other one is going to be reflecting a different way that may not match or may match.
Yes. So I can tell you that when I initially had put this presentation together, I had initially used Republicans and Democrats rather than liberals and conservatives, and the results were the exact same. I chose to talk about it this way because being a Republican or being a Democrat doesn't inherently reflect anything philosophical. It reflects a commitment to a party. It reflects the fact that you are you follow a team. You're a spectator of a team. It's like you like the Cincinnati Reds or something like that, right? I like the Republican Party. Conservative and liberal reflects your underlying philosophical view towards the world, which may inform your political position, but they're not the exact same thing. In fact, in a lot of other countries around the world, of course, you can be a liberal but a part of 2 or 3 different parties, right? That's, we're lucky or unlucky as it is in the United States that that's not the case. Does anybody else have any? That is an important point.
Any question like inside, what they act like, what you liberal or conservative?
I'll show you here. We asked both questions. We asked both questions. I'll show you here in a second when I get to the data. But that is a good question, and it's actually tricky to ask people what their ideological preferences are because, again, so people have an affective disposition towards ideological preferences, but they also have a philosophical disposition. And when you're asking things on a survey, it's not entirely clear whether or not you're eliciting an affective perspective or sort of a deep philosophical response. Again, though, those are important things. And I can talk a little bit more about that as I get to measurement. But I just want to hammer home this point of motivated cognition. It's really pronounced the way that people receive information. It not only affects the way that they receive and dismiss information that they happen to disagree with, it affects the information that they look for in the first place, right? It affects the way in which sort of self-described conservatives, Republicans, search for information that happens to be consistent with their ideological beliefs. They watch Fox News, right? Because Fox News doesn't offend them. It makes them feel good. about the world around them, whereas Democrats, right, they search for different sources of information. And those different sources of information agree with them, and as a result, of course they think that climate change is happening because the only media, the only information that they're taking in says that it is, right? And so this, I'm going to submit, we can have a discussion more broadly, is the primary reason as to why politically, ideologically distinctive individuals have different opinions about climate change, right? This last point is the critical point here. People are not objective evaluators of the information they seek and receive from others about climate change. They are fundamentally biased by their political predispositions. In this particular presentation, I want to ask this sort of more basic, this more fundamental question. So, in addition to the biased information they receive from others, are people objective evaluators of the information that they collect about weather and climate on their own, right? Can they take in data about the weather and climate around them in a nonpartisan fashion, right? Are we neutral observers of the world around us, or do our political predispositions fundamentally change the way in which we take in data about the world around us? Right? And if that's the case, that's an even more serious problem than we had initially thought, right? And that, again, could explain the divergence of opinion as it relates to climate change. If Republicans are experiencing a completely different world around them, a completely different climate around them than are Democrats, it would fundamentally alter their views about whether or not climate change is happening, right? So that's the first question. Or, again, does motivated cognition systematically distort the way in which people experience and perceive the weather around them? As I said, I sort of foreshadowed, do liberals and conservatives that live in the same area, that live in Norman, Oklahoma, perceive weather and climate conditions in a way that comports with their ideological priors, right? Or do objective conditions, experiences, temperature, rainfall rate, wind speeds, do those things override ideological predispositions and allow people to see how the weather and climate are changing around them? To answer these questions, of course, we need to collect and compare, one, data on the way in which individuals perceive the weather and climate around them. Right? We need to ask people questions about what they think is happening in the world around them. Right? We also need data on the ideological beliefs that those individuals hold, right? And then last but not least, we need data on the weather and climate conditions that those individuals actually experience, right? We need data on what's actually happening in the real world to compare against people's perceptions about what's happening in the real world, and then ideology to see which one really matters the most, their ideology, right, their political predispositions, or their experiences. Just so happens that we are blessed recently, we were blessed with a big grant in the state of Oklahoma as part of the Oklahoma EPSCoR project that I told you about before that has allowed us to collect and integrate all of this data into a single project. We are collecting data on weather and climate perceptions as part of the mesonet survey of Oklahoma residents. I'll probably get this wrong, but I believe mesonet stands for Mesoscale Integrated Sociogeographic Net. Was I right? Well, yeah, see. So it's something like that. It's more or less, if you guys have heard of the Oklahoma mesonet, it's more or less the social equivalent of the Oklahoma mesonet. So instead of just taking objective conditions at random points throughout Oklahoma, we are taking perceptions about weather and climate at various points throughout Oklahoma so that we can match the two against one another, right? And this is the gold standard of surveys. This is an address-based random sample frame that is geographically matched to the Oklahoma mesonet. So this is proportionately drawn randomly based on addresses. So we are really confident as a result of that research design that the results we get here are generalizable to at least the population of Oklahoma. I'm going to talk here about the first wave of responses that we collected not too long ago. Consisted of 607 people. We're almost finished collecting wave 2. Something like 80% of the wave 1 respondents have responded to wave 2, and then we've got a bunch more on top of that. So this will be, when it's all over, a longitudinal data set. with panel data supplemented incrementally throughout. So we have a very, very rich array of data to compare against what's actually happening in Oklahoma. Here are two examples of questions that we ask people on the survey. We ask a whole bunch of questions about the weather and climate. Here are two sort of longer-term climate-type questions that we ask people. With respect to temperature, we ask people in the last 3 years, would you say that overall the average temperatures in the area around where you live have increased, decreased, or stayed about the same as temperatures in previous years? This is what people said. 14% of people said it's decreased, temperatures have decreased. 52% said that they've stayed about the same in the last 3 years as they've had in the past. 34% of people said that they've increased. Then we asked people about drought. We also asked people about floods, all kind of other things. Drought is particularly topical to climate change and global warming. We asked people in the area around where you live, has the severity of drought conditions increased, decreased, or stayed about the same over the last 3 years as the severity of drought conditions in previous years? This is what the people of Oklahoma said. They said 11% say that they think drought conditions have decreased. 37% said that they've stayed about the same, and 52% say that they've increased, right? So here is how we measure weather perceptions for the purposes of this project that I'm going to talk about today. Again, this is a much broader project. I can't talk about it all, but I'm happy to answer questions or deflect my questions to Jack Friedman in the back, who knows all answers to all things mesonet. They had to answer questions about ideological beliefs. Just to get a little bit at that question earlier, this same survey, we asked people on a scale of political ideology, individuals can be arranged from strongly liberal to strongly conservative. Which of the following categories best describes your view? Strongly liberal, liberal, slightly liberal, middle of the road, slightly conservative, conservative, or strongly conservative. I would probably submit to you, as long as you don't tell anybody, that what we're actually measuring here is people's affective views towards ideological dispositions. We are not talking specifically about the philosophical differences between what it means to be a liberal versus a conservative. We basically ask people, which camp do you identify with most? And in Oklahoma, as people in Oklahoma probably already know, we are not a balanced state, right? There are fewer self-described liberals in Oklahoma than there are self-described conservatives, right? And that balance is pretty easy to recognize here. See, about 20% say that they're middle of the road, 23% say that they're liberal, and all the rest say that they're somewhere between slightly conservative, conservative, or strongly conservative. Okay, so that's the background that we're working with here in Oklahoma as it relates to things like perceptions about climate change. Then, of course, in addition to data on perceptions and data on ideological dispositions, we need data on weather and climate conditions, which in this particular project we obtained from the Oklahoma Mesonet. And as probably many of you know, the Mesonet consists of about 120 stations throughout the state of Oklahoma that measures a number of things on a regular basis, on sort of 5-minute intervals, I think it is. Things like it measures air and soil temperature, rainfall rates, wind speeds, and directions, and a host of other variables. So we have a very rich set of environmental data that we can pull throughout the state of Oklahoma with high geographic resolution and then match that to the survey data that we're collecting, right? We can interpolate from those 120 stations to a gridded surface and then extract values from those gridded surfaces to respondent locations, because we know, remember, where the respondent lives because we have their address. We know exactly where people live. So we more or less know with relative high precision what the actual temperature and climate experiences, what the actual weather and climate experiences that people are having. In this particular project that I'm talking about today, I'm going to match temperature and drought, these questions here, with these two data points here, with these two variables here. Variable 1 is temperature anomaly, which is a pretty basic variable that equals average air temperatures in 2011, 12, and 13 minus average air temperatures in the last 15 years. As many of you know, temperatures have warmed up a little bit, not much, about 2 degrees throughout Oklahoma as compared to the last 15 years. Okay, and then drought, it's a little bit, it's the same indicator. Instead of measuring things like soil moisture, we just use a simple measure here, which is rain anomaly, right? And we take the average total rainfall in 2011, 12, and 13 minus the average total rainfall in the last 15 years. We can and are working to develop more systematic indicators of drought, but I think this does a pretty good job for purposes of today. Right? And these maps just represent the interpolated surfaces from which we extracted values to match our mesonet respondents. The analytical method I'm going to show now, so basically what we have to do is statistically compare perceptions about temperature and drought to objective conditions, objective weather and climate conditions, and then also compare those to ideological predispositions. Right? And I do this in this project using something called ordered logistic regression. It's basically a statistical technique that allows you to essentially classify responses to ordinal questions based on some number of independent variables. These are very simple models where perceptions vary as a function of some intercept parameter plus temperature or rain anomalies, and then plus political ideology. Right? In both cases, we have two separate models. The hypotheses are pretty simple. If people are objective evaluators of the information they collect about the weather and climate around them, then temperature and rain anomalies in the area will significantly influence their perceptions about temperature and drought. Right? If they're objective evaluators, what's actually happening will affect their perceptions of what's happening. If they are motivated, if they are engaging in motivated cognition, if that systematically distorts the way in which they perceive the weather and climate around them, then ideological predispositions, not objective conditions, will significantly influence their perceptions of what's going on. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anybody have any questions?
Number one, what's information, the information that they collect? Is that something physical, or is it also like watching weather news?
In this case, it's primarily physical. The empirical, the sensory information that they collect. Okay, so here are our expectations. If we graph this, Derek's going to get mad at me, but I have to walk over here for a second. If we graph this, right, we expect that if people are objective evaluators, as temperatures anomalies increase, as temperatures go up, the proportion of people who say that temperatures have increased, that probability will go up, whereas the probability that people said they stayed the same or decreased will go down. Does that make sense? Right? And if, again, people are objective evaluators of this information, as conservatism increases, as political ideology goes from slightly liberal to strongly liberal to strongly conservative, it'll essentially have no effect, right? Zero effect. It won't change the baseline probabilities about what people said in response to these questions. The opposite, of course, is true with respect to drought, right? As rain anomaly increases, the probability that people said drought has increased will decrease, right? Does that make sense? It's rained more, people will probably say no. In fact, drought has not increased. Instead, they'll say it has either stayed the same or it has decreased. The models, I guess I should point out, if people are actually engaging in motivated cognition, you would expect the exact opposite to happen in both these cases. You would have flat lines over here. Objective conditions say nothing about the way in which people are observing the world around them. And these lines would be statistically significant and positive in whatever direction. Okay. Here's what we find. Right, so we've modeled these variables using that ordered logistic regression procedure that I told you before. And here's the finding with respect to temperature. Basically, temperature anomaly has no effect, zero effect on the temperatures that people are observing in the weather and climate world around them. What's actually happening in this case is that political ideology is fundamentally affecting the way in which people are perceiving temperature change in the world around them, right? As conservatism increases from 1 to 7, the likelihood that people said that temperatures are increasing decreased from about 0.6 all the way down to 0.2. Self-described strong conservatives was very, very unlikely to say that temperatures were increasing. Instead, those folks were saying that temperatures were either staying the same or decreasing. Right? That green line is what happens as you move from strong liberal to strong conservative. People are saying probability of saying that temperatures have decreased increases, right? Which is, again, the exact opposite of what's actually happened. Right? So I would submit to you that this particular graph is an example of motivated cognition distorting the way in which people perceive the weather and climate around them. Here are the findings for drought. If you remember those graphs I showed you before, this is more or less the exact opposite of what we showed you before, right? Rain anomaly, people's experience, objective experience with drought, fundamentally or systematically affects the way in which they understand drought to be happening. It affects their perceptions in a statistically significant way. People that experience more rain were significantly less likely to say that drought is more severe than people who experience less rain, and the opposite is the case with respect to the people who said stayed the same or was less severe. Right? And then if you look over at this political prior side, you see that political dispositions have almost no effect on people's perceptions of whether or not drought is happening in their local area. I would suggest that this is an example where motivated cognition is not affecting the way in which people are perceiving the world around them. Okay, so the conclusions are pretty straightforward, and I'm more excited about the conversation, so I'll move through these pretty quick. First off, public opinion about climate change is polarized along ideological lines. We all knew that. I didn't see any hands go up when I asked if that was not the case. Second off, motivated cognition, in my mind and in most people's mind, I think, explains some of this polarization. People look for or accept information that is consistent with their ideological predispositions, whereas they avoid or reject information that is inconsistent with their political beliefs. Third, this problem might be worse than we thought. Motivated cognition seems, in some instances, to influence the way in which people perceive the weather and climate around them. Liberals and conservatives that live in the exact same area experience completely different temperature conditions. That's problematic, I think, for trying to convince people that climate change is happening. This means, of course, that discussions about the impact of climate change that are framed in terms of temperature increases are unlikely to resonate with a large portion of the U.S. population. The portion of the U.S. population that identifies as conservative is large and growing, right? And as this percentage goes up, the likelihood that these people are going to revise their beliefs about climate change, if we continue to talk about temperature increases, if we continue to show them the hockey sticks, then they are not going to, that message is not going to resonate with them because their experience on the ground is that temperatures are not changing. Okay? In fact, they are decreasing in some cases, right? As yet, however, thank God, perceptions of drought seem to be insulated from the influence of motivated cognition. This may provide, I think, an opportunity to discuss the impacts of climate change in a way that does not activate ideological force fields. Perhaps if everybody can agree what drought looks like, and if everybody experiences similar things with drought, perhaps that's some common ground on which we can communicate about the impacts of climate change, right? And as communicators, we're all, whether we like it or not, as communicators of climate science information, I believe that our job is twofold. First, our job is to protect this opportunity, to protect drought from becoming politically toxic. Don't know how to do that, but I believe that it is our job to make sure that perceptions of drought do not become polarized, as have perceptions of temperature. If that's the case, that's one less thing that we can talk about when we're talking or trying to communicate the impacts of climate change, right? Our other job is to identify other dimensions, in addition to drought, other impacts that are not yet distorted by political beliefs. I hope there are others out there. And it is our job to figure out what those are. Perhaps it's decreasing reservoirs. Perhaps it's any number of things. I don't want to speculate too widely because I have no data to support my speculations, although that hasn't stopped me in the past. But that is our job to figure those things out. and then to communicate on the basis of those things. And second, our job is to figure out, if we can, how to attenuate the effects of motivated cognition. This, it turns out, is a lot harder. How do we get people, despite the fact that they're taking in information in a fundamentally distorted way, to agree that temperatures are rising? How do we convince conservatives to open their eyes, right, and realize and experience the same world that other people are? Or how do we get liberals to do the same thing, right? Because they're overestimating the degree to which temperatures are increasing, right? So how do we get people to essentially open their eyes and sort of throw off these partisan blinders and understand the same empirical world so that we can make policy in a way that is consistent with what's actually happening rather than the way in which people conceive or perceive that information? How do we accomplish this? Well, I was initially going to talk a little bit about this, but then I realized there are a lot smarter people out there that know a lot more about this than I do. Many of them are my colleagues. And so I'm going to leave you with some suggested readings. I'm going to give you some homework. Most of these readings are about this point number 2, this point of how to figure out how to attenuate the effects of motivated cognition. This first paper is a great paper from a social psychologist about how self-affirmation affects that process. Dan Kahan is probably the world's foremost expert in climate science communication. At least I would argue that he is. He would probably argue that he is too. He has a wonderful blog and he publishes a lot on the topic. And he has come to the consensus with himself, I guess, that we don't know how to fix the communication failure because there's not enough evidence out there. What you have is people like me who are doing experiments on surveys and in laboratories, and you don't have people like you who are actually communicating with people and measuring the effect of that communication to tell us what's actually working. We need data in the real world of climate science communication, in the real world, to show us how people are responding to these things, rather than data in the laboratories and on surveys. That's what he argues. Of course, he's like me and does most of his research in laboratories and surveys, but he has high hopes for folks like you. And then last but not least, there's this really good article in Risk Analysis that was just published lately. It's a great piece on this whole notion of self-affirmation, how if we embrace this notion of self-affirmation, we can influence the way in which people think about the anthropogenic climate change and the relationship between those thoughts and their values. So thank you. I'm excited to answer your questions.